Sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen when someone finally finds the courage to say what everyone else is afraid to whisper. We've all watched someone we care about make a choice that breaks our heart, knowing we should speak up but feeling powerless to change their path. In the village of Eldthorp, Inga was about to marry Ragnar the Bold, a man twice her age, chosen by her father for gold and power. The whole village gathered to watch this ceremony that would secure political alliances but destroy a young woman's hopes for love. As the sacred vows were about to begin, Freyja, Inga's childhood friend, did something unthinkable. She threw herself before Bjarke Wolfborn, the jarl's giant enforcer, and begged him to stop the wedding. Everyone expected this feared warrior to silence her immediately. Instead, Bjarke stood up and spoke words that would change everything. What secret could make the most loyal man defy his master? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, wrapping the village of Eldthorp in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. From her window in the great hall, Inga could see the fishing boats returning with their dawn catch, their weathered hulls cutting through water that reflected the pale Nordic sky. She pressed her palm against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, trying to memorize this moment, the last morning she would wake as herself. Today was her wedding day. The carved wooden cross hanging around her neck felt heavier than usual, its familiar weight a reminder of simpler times when her greatest worry was whether the barley harvest would be sufficient for winter. Freyja had given her this cross 3 summers ago, carved from driftwood they'd found together on the shore. "For protection," Freyja had said, with that knowing smile that always made Inga wonder if her friend could see things others couldn't. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "My lady?" The voice belonged to Astrid, her nurse since childhood, though the woman's once strong hands now trembled with age. "Your father wishes to speak with you before the preparations begin." Inga turned from the window, smoothing the simple woolen dress she'd worn for what felt like the last time. Soon she would be draped in the ceremonial robes, befitting Ragnar's bride, silk and gold thread, imported from distant lands, symbols of wealth that felt like chains around her heart. Jarl Magnus waited in his private chamber, a man whose broad shoulders still carried the memory of battles fought in his youth. His beard, once golden like Inga's hair, had turned the color of winter frost, and deep lines mapped his face like the fjords carved through their homeland. He stood with his back to her, studying the tapestry that depicted their family lineage warriors, and wise men stretching back 7 generations. "Father," Inga's voice carried the respect due to his position, though something inside her had grown cold toward the man who valued alliances over his daughter's happiness. "Inga." He turned, and for a moment she glimpsed something that might have been regret in his weathered features. "You look like your mother when she was your age. She had that same fire in her eyes. Did you marry her off to secure a trade agreement?" The words escaped before she could stop them, sharper than she'd intended. Magnus's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his beard. "I loved your mother deeply," he said quietly. "But love is a luxury leaders cannot always afford. Ragnar brings us protection, trade routes, and 50 skilled warriors. The King of Norway himself has blessed this union. And what do I bring? Besides my womb for his heirs, you bring honor to our family name," his voice hardened, "and you will learn to find contentment in duty, as I did." Inga wanted to ask if he'd ever wondered what life might have been like if he'd chosen differently, but the weight of expectation in his gaze silenced her. This conversation had been rehearsed in her mind 100 times, yet now that it was happening, she felt like a child again, small and powerless. "The ceremony begins at midday," Magnus continued. "Ragnar's party arrived last night with gifts from his father's lands, amber, furs, silver arm rings for your dowry. He is a good man, Inga, harsh when necessary but good. She nodded because no other response would serve, though her heart screamed against the words. Ragnar the Bold was indeed good at many things: warfare, trading, commanding respect through fear. But goodness of heart, the kind that mattered in the quiet moments between husband and wife, remained to be seen. As she left her father's chamber, Inga nearly collided with Freyja in the corridor. Her childhood friend carried an armful of meadow, flowers, violets, and wild roses that would adorn the ceremonial altar. Freyja's dark hair fell in simple braids, and her dress, though clean and mended, spoke of her station as daughter to the village blacksmith. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Freyja observed, setting down the flowers to study Inga's face. "Perhaps I have. The ghost of who I used to be." They walked together through the great hall, past servants preparing for the feast that would follow the ceremony. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and barrels of mead that would flow freely once the vows were spoken. The hall buzzed with activity, yet Inga felt strangely removed from it all, as though she were watching preparations for someone else's life. "Do you remember when we were children?" Freyja said softly, "and we would pretend to be shield maidens, sailing off to explore distant lands. We were going to see the great cities beyond the northern seas, build our own settlement, where women could choose their own paths. We could still run away." Freyja's tone was light, but something serious flickered in her green eyes. "Take a boat tonight and sail south. My cousin in Denmark would hide us." For a heartbeat, Inga let herself imagine it: the wind in their hair, the freedom of open water, a life chosen rather than assigned. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. And bring war to Eldthorp. Ragnar would see it as an insult that could only be answered with blood. My father would lose his alliance, and our people would suffer. "So, you sacrifice yourself for the greater good, as women have done for generations." Inga's voice carried a bitterness she rarely allowed herself to feel. "Perhaps our daughters will know different choices." They paused near the great hearth, where a fire crackled despite the summer warmth, its light dancing across the carved runes that told the story of their gods. Freyja's hand found hers, calloused from years of helping, in her father's forge, warm and steady. "If there was a way to stop this without bloodshed," Freyja whispered, "would you take it?" Before Inga could answer, heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Bjarke Wolfborn. The man filled the doorway like a mountain given human form, his shoulders so broad they nearly touched the frame. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, braided with leather cords, and his beard reached nearly to his chest. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, set in a face that had seen 43 years of life and countless battles. Bjarke served as her father's enforcer, the man called upon when words failed and strength was required. She had never heard him speak more than a few words at a time, and then only when directly addressed. He was a weapon in human form, loyal to her father beyond question. "My lord requires your presence," he said to Inga, his voice a rumble like distant thunder. "The guests have arrived." As they walked toward the guard of the main hall, Inga noticed how servants and warriors alike stepped aside for Bjarke, not out of courtesy, but from genuine fear. Stories followed him like shadows of enemy raiders broken across his knee, of battles where he had stood alone against a dozen men and emerged victorious. Yet she had also seen him with gentle care for injured animals, and once, when she was 12, he had carved a wooden horse for her when she'd been ill with fever. The great hall had been transformed. Banners hung from the rafters, displaying both her family's crest and Ragnar's a wolf's head surrounded by crossed swords. The ceremonial altar stood at the center, draped in white cloth and adorned with the flowers Freyja had gathered. Guests filled the long benches, local lords, warriors, merchants, and farmers, all dressed in their finest clothes for this union of houses. Ragnar himself stood near the altar, and Inga forced herself to study the man who would become her husband. He was perhaps 35, winters old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years campaigning in distant lands. His red beard was neatly braided, and gold arm rings proclaimed his wealth. When he smiled at her approach, she noticed his teeth were still good, a blessing at his age. "Lady Inga." He took her hand and pressed it to his lips in the formal greeting. "You are even more beautiful than the skalds claimed," she murmured the appropriate response, playing her part in this performance. Around them, conversations buzzed with speculation about the trade agreements this marriage would bring, the warriors who would now call Eldthorp an ally, the grandchildren who would unite two powerful bloodlines. As the morning progressed toward the ceremony hour, Inga found herself studying the faces around her. Here was her entire world, people she had known since childhood, who had watched her grow from a wild-haired girl into the woman she had become. They looked at her with approval, pride, even excitement. Only Freyja's eyes held sympathy for what this day would cost. The ceremony preparations continued around her like a tide she could not stop. Women from both families began the ritual of dressing the bride, removing her simple clothes and replacing them with layer upon layer of silk and wool dyed in rich colors. The wedding crown, passed down through generations of her family, was placed upon her head, silver worked into intricate patterns, heavy with the weight of tradition. When she caught her reflection in the polished bronze mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back was beautiful, regal, everything a Viking bride should be. But something vital was missing from her eyes, something that belonged to the girl who had dreamed of adventures beyond these shores. "It's time," her father announced, and the words fell like stones into still water. As they began the procession toward the altar, Inga felt as though she were walking toward her own burial mound. The weight of duty pressed down upon her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Behind her, she could hear Freyja's footsteps, and somehow that small comfort gave her the strength to continue placing one foot in front of the other. The moment that would change everything was approaching, though none of them, not Inga, not Magnus, not even Ragnar, could have imagined how completely their world was about to be transformed by the words of a simple blacksmith's daughter and the response of a man who had never spoken against his lord's will. The wedding ceremony of Inga Magnus' daughter was about to become something else entirely. The great hall fell silent as the ceremony began, every voice stilled by the weight of tradition that stretched back generations. Inga stood beside Ragnar at the ceremonial altar, her hands trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. The wedding crown felt impossibly heavy upon her head, each piece of worked silver a reminder of the expectations, pressing down upon her. Eric the Wise, the village's eldest skald, raised his gnarled staff and began the ancient words that would bind her life to Ragnar's. His voice carried across the hall like wind through the mountains, speaking of honor, duty, and the sacred bonds that held their society together. The ritual blade lay upon the altar between them, its edge gleaming in the firelight. They would soon cut their palms and mingle their blood, sealing their union in the old way. From the corner of her eye, Inga could see her father standing with the other jarls, his face a mask of satisfaction as his political maneuvering reached its culmination. Magnus had arranged this marriage with the precision of a military campaign, and now victory was within his grasp. Ragnar's warriors would strengthen their defenses, his trade routes would bring wealth to Eldthorp, and the alliance would position their family among the most powerful in the region. Ragnar himself stood straight and proud, his red beard newly braided for the occasion. When he glanced at her, his smile was not unkind. This was a man who believed he was gaining a beautiful wife and honoring her with his name. That he had never asked what she wanted from life seemed not to occur to him, or perhaps such considerations were simply beyond his understanding of how the world worked. "The gods smile upon this union," Eric intoned, gesturing toward the sacred flames that burned on either side of the altar. "May Thor grant strength to this house, may Odin grant wisdom, and may Freyja grant fertility and abundance." The mention of the goddess Freyja drew Inga's thoughts to her friend, who stood among the crowd with her father the blacksmith. Even from a distance she could see the tension in Freyja's stance, the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. Something desperate flickered in her friend's green eyes, a wildness that made Inga's heart race with sudden fear. "The blood binding shall now commence," Eric announced, reaching for the ceremonial blade. "Let the families witness this sacred joining." This was the moment of no return. Once their blood mingled upon the altar stone, the marriage would be complete in the eyes of both gods and men. Ragnar extended his hand, palm upward, ready to make the cut that would seal their fate. The hall held its collective breath, 200 souls witnessing the forging of an alliance that would shape their future. Then Freyja's voice cut through the silence like a sword through silk. "Wait!" Every head turned toward the sound. Freyja stood frozen for a heartbeat, her face pale as fresh snow, and then she was moving. She pushed through the crowd with desperate urgency, people stumbling aside in confusion and shock. Inga watched in horror as her friend broke through the circle of nobles surrounding the altar and threw herself to her knees, not before the wedding couple, but at the feet of Bjarke Wolfborn. The giant stood at Magnus's right hand as always, silent and imposing. His pale blue eyes widened slightly as Freyja prostrated herself before him, her dark hair spilling across the rushes that covered the floor. The hall erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. What madness was this? What possessed a blacksmith's daughter to interrupt such a sacred ceremony? Bjarke Wolfborn. Freyja's voice carried clearly through the chaos, trembling with emotion but determined. "I beg you, by the memory of your mother, by the honor you bear, by every kindness you have ever shown, don't let her marry him." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Men reached for their weapons, women covered their mouths in shock, and Magnus's face darkened with rage. Ragnar stepped forward, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Seize her," Magnus commanded, his voice cutting through the tumult. How dare this peasant interrupt? But Bjarke did not move to obey. The enforcer who had never questioned an order stood, motionless, staring down at the woman kneeling before him. Something passed across his weathered features: surprise, recognition, perhaps even pain. The hall waited for him to drag Freyja away, to silence her with the swift brutality for which he was known. Instead, Bjarke Wolfborn knelt. The sight of the giant lowering himself to Freyja's level sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. This was a man who had never knelt to anyone save the gods themselves, who had stood unbowed before kings and jarls. Yet here he was, bringing his massive frame down so that his eyes met hers. "Speak," he said quietly, though his voice carried to every corner of the hall. Freyja raised her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She is with child," she whispered, the words barely audible yet somehow reaching every ear. "Inga carries a child that is not Ragnar's." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the gods themselves had drawn the breath from every lung. Inga felt the world spin. Around her, her knees threatening to buckle. She pressed a hand to her stomach instinctively, where beneath her wedding finery the smallest swell spoke of a secret she had shared with no one. No one except Freyja. "Lies," Magnus snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he looked at his daughter's ashen face. The ravings of a jealous girl who, "The child is mine." Bjarke's words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. He rose to his full height, towering over the assembly, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the enforcer who spoke only when necessary continued speaking. "3 months ago, when the merchant ships arrived from the southern lands, I found Inga by the harbour after sunset. She had been walking alone, something I had warned her against, with raiders in the area. We talked, truly talked, for the first time in years." His voice grew softer, though it still carried to every corner of the hall. "We spoke of books, of ideas, of dreams for what life might hold beyond duty and obligation. She asked questions I had never been asked, listened to answers I had never given. Inga stared at him in amazement. This man, who had always seemed like a force of nature, silent and immovable, was revealing depths she had never suspected. We met again the following night, and the night after. I know the wisdom of our stations, the impossibility of what grew between us. But knowledge and feeling are not the same thing. What happened between us was not taken by force or given lightly. It was a choice made by two souls who found in each other something they had not known they were seeking. The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Ragnar's face had gone purple with rage, his hand now fully gripping his sword. Magnus looked as though he had been struck by lightning, and the assembled nobles whispered frantically among themselves. The political implications crashed through the hall, like dominoes a broken alliance. Ragnar's public humiliation, the threat of blood vengeance. But Bjarke was not finished. He turned to face Magnus directly, meeting his lord's gaze without flinching. You have been my jarl for 20 years, and I have served you faithfully. I have killed your enemies, enforced your will, and never questioned your commands. But this woman carries my blood, and I will not stand silent while she is given to another man to raise my child as his own. The betrayal in Magnus's eyes cut deeper than any blade. This was his most trusted warrior, the man who had stood at his side through countless battles, who had sworn an oath of absolute loyalty. That oath lay shattered now, broken on the altar of an impossible love. You would throw away everything, Magnus said, his voice heavy with disbelief. Your honor, your position, your life for one night with a woman above your station? Not one night, Bjarke replied quietly. Many nights. And yes, I would. Freyja rose from her knees, her face shining with tears, and something that might have been relief. She loves him, she said, her voice stronger now. I have watched her fade away these past weeks, watched her spirit die a little more each day as this ceremony approached. She loves him as he loves her, and their child deserves to know its true father. Inga found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. It's true. She looked at Ragnar, then at her father, and finally at Bjarke. All of it is true. The admission shattered the last pretense of normalcy. Ragnar drew his sword with a ring of steel, his warriors following suit. Magnus's men responded in kind, and suddenly the wedding hall had become an armed camp on the verge of violence. The careful political alliance lay in ruins, and blood seemed inevitable. But in that moment of chaos and revelation, as the foundations of their world crumbled around them, Inga felt something she had not experienced in months' hope. Whatever came next, the truth was finally free. The clash of steel rang through the great hall as 20 swords left their sheaths in the span of a heartbeat. Ragnar's warriors faced Magnus's men across the ceremonial altar, the sacred space now transformed into a battlefield waiting to erupt. The wedding guests pressed themselves against the walls, mothers clutching children to their breasts, while the elderly sought refuge behind overturned benches. "Lower your weapons," Magnus commanded, though his own hand rested on his sword hilt. His voice carried the authority of decades of leadership, but beneath the surface, Inga could hear the strain of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. There will be no bloodshed in this sacred hall. Ragnar's face remained purple with rage, his sword pointed directly at Bjarke's chest. Your oathbreaker has dishonored my name before witnesses. Only blood can answer such an insult. Then you shall have it, Bjarke replied calmly, making no move to draw his own weapon. His massive frame seemed relaxed, almost at peace, as if the confession had lifted a weight from his shoulders. But know that I do not regret the choices that brought us to this moment. Inga stepped forward, her wedding crown catching the firelight as she moved between the two men. Stop. Her voice was quiet, but something in her tone made both warriors pause. If blood must be spilled, let it be for the right reasons. Ragnar, you have been wronged. But the wrong was not intentional. We never meant for this to happen. Intention matters little when the result is public humiliation. Ragnar snarled, though his sword remained trained on Bjarke rather than her. I came here to claim a bride, and found myself claiming another man's leavings. The crude words hit Inga like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Bjarke moved. Not toward his weapon, but toward Ragnar, his pale blue eyes blazing with sudden fury. Speak of her with respect, or I will tear your tongue from your head. You forget yourself, Oathbreaker. You are nothing now, a landless man with no family, no position, no honor. What can you offer her but a life of wandering and want? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Inga saw doubt flicker across Bjarke's features. It was one thing to confess love in a moment of passion, another to face the practical realities of their situation. A man without a lord had no place in their society, no means of protection or provision. What future could they possibly build together? Freyja moved to Inga's side, her face still pale, but her jaw set with determination. Around her neck hung a leather cord bearing a small iron hammer, Thor's symbol, forged by her own father's hands. She fingered it nervously as she spoke. "There are other ways to live," she said quietly. "Other places where a man's worth is measured by his character rather than his birth." Magnus turned his cold gaze on the blacksmith's daughter. "And what would you know of such places, girl?" "I know that my cousin Olaf established a settlement in the Western Islands, beyond the reach of kings and jarls. He sends word that they welcome skilled craftsmen, warriors who can work the land, people willing to build something new." Freyja's voice grew stronger as she continued. "They judge a man by his deeds, not his bloodline." "A fantasy," Magnus dismissed, but something in his expression suggested the idea troubled him more than he cared to admit. "Perhaps," Freyja replied, "but sometimes fantasies become reality when people have the courage to pursue them." Ragnar lowered his sword slightly, his attention shifting from immediate violence to longer-term concerns. "And you think to take ship for these mythical lands? With what resources, what provisions? You have no vessel, no supplies, no way to—" "I have a ship." The voice came from an unexpected source. Thorvald the merchant, a weathered man who traded along the coastal routes, stepped forward from the crowd. His presence at the wedding had been unremarkable, until this moment one of many traders invited to witness the alliance between great families. "My ship lies at anchor in the harbour," Thorvald continued. "She's seaworthy, provisioned for a month's voyage, and I had planned to sail south within the week. But perhaps a different destination might prove more profitable." Magnus stared at the merchant with suspicion. "Why would you involve yourself in this matter?" Thorvald's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "Because I have sailed to Olaf's settlement twice now, carrying goods and messages between the old world and the new. The stories Freyja tells are true. They need skilled people, willing to work hard and build something lasting. And because—" his expression grew more serious, "I have seen too many lives destroyed by the rigid expectations of station and birth. Sometimes change requires someone willing to provide the means." Inga felt a flutter of hope in her chest, dangerous and fragile as a bird's wing. Could it truly be possible? Could they simply sail away from all of this, the politics, the expectations, the weight of tradition that threatened to crush them all? But even as the possibility took shape, the obstacles loomed large. Her father's face had grown darker with each word, his jaw working with barely contained rage. The political ramifications of her departure would be severe, not just the broken alliance with Ragnar, but the message it would send to other lords about the reliability of his word. "You speak of running away," Magnus said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Of abandoning duty, family, everything that makes us who we are. Is this truly the choice you would make, daughter? To become outlaws, wanderers with no place in civilized society?" The words cut deep because they carried truth. What they contemplated was more than defying a marriage arrangement, it was rejecting the very foundations of their world. Yet as Inga looked at Bjarke, saw the hope and fear warring in his eyes, She realized that some foundations deserved to be challenged. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it's time to build a new kind of civilization. One where love matters as much as duty, where children are raised by parents who chose each other freely." Ragnar sheathed his sword with a sharp motion, though his face remained hard as granite. "Keep your philosophies and your dreams of distant lands, but know this, if you choose this path, you choose to become my enemies. I will not forget this insult, and neither will my allies. Should our paths cross again, it will not end in words." Bjarke nodded gravely. "I understand, and I accept the consequences of our choices." "As do I," Inga added, though her voice trembled slightly. "But I will not spend my life as a prize to be traded for political advantage. If that makes me your enemy, so be it." The weight of the moment settled over them all, like a heavy cloak. Lines were being drawn, alliances shattered, futures rewritten. Magnus looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of minutes. The confident jarl replaced by a father watching his carefully laid plans crumble. "If this is truly your choice," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, "then you are no longer my daughter. Take what you will, but take it quickly. You have until sunset to be gone from my lands." The finality of the words struck Inga like a physical blow, but she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. "Then we will be gone." As the crowd began to disperse, some in anger, others in amazement at what they had witnessed, Freyja approached Thorvald with questions about provisions and departure times. Plans were taking shape, tentative and fragile, but real nonetheless. The wedding of Inga Magnusdóttir was over. The journey toward an uncertain future had begun. The hours following the broken ceremony passed like a fevered dream. Inga found herself in her childhood chambers, for what she knew would be the last time, hastily packing the few possessions she could carry. Her hands shook as she folded the simple woolen dresses that would serve her better than silk in whatever life awaited beyond the horizon. Freyja worked beside her in silence, occasionally glancing toward the window where the sun tracked its relentless path across the sky. Sunset was only hours away, and with it would come the moment of no return. The magnitude of what they were attempting felt overwhelming, abandoning everything familiar for the promise of a new life in distant lands. "Are we making the right choice?" Inga whispered, holding up the small wooden horse Bjarke had carved for her years ago. The memory of his gentle hands crafting something beautiful seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation, yet it had always been these quiet moments that revealed his true nature. "I don't know," Freyja admitted, pausing in her packing, "but I know that watching you marry Ragnar would have been wrong. You would have withered away like a flower denied sunlight." A knock at the door interrupted them. Astrid entered without ceremony, her aged face creased with worry. In her hands, she carried a leather satchel that clinked softly with the sound of metal. "From your father," she said simply, setting the bag on the bed. "He may have disowned you publicly, but he is still a father. These are silver pieces from his personal treasury, enough to establish a household wherever you land." Her voice cracked slightly. "And this from your mother's things." She withdrew a delicate silver brooch shaped like a tree, its branches intertwining in intricate patterns. Inga recognized it immediately. Her mother had worn it on special occasions, claiming it brought good fortune to new endeavors. "He said to tell you that some choices echo through generations," Astrid continued. "He hopes yours will echo more kindly than his own." The gesture brought tears to Inga's eyes. Even in his anger and disappointment, Magnus remained her father. The gift spoke of forgiveness he could not voice publicly, love he could not express without appearing weak to his men. "Tell him," Inga began, then stopped. What message could bridge the gulf that had opened between them? "Tell him I understand the burden of leadership, and I pray he will forgive me for choosing a different path." After Astrid departed, the two women finished their preparations in contemplative silence. As the afternoon wore on, other visitors arrived, bearing gifts and well wishes. Eric the Wise brought scrolls containing maps of the northern seas and advice on reading weather signs. The village healer, an ancient woman named Solveig, pressed packets of medicinal herbs into Freyja's hands, along with instructions for caring for mother and child during the coming journey. "Birth is the same everywhere," Solveig said with a knowing smile, "but having the right knowledge can mean the difference between joy and sorrow." Most surprising was the visit from Bjorn, Inga's younger brother. At 17, he had always lived in the shadow of expectations, training to become a warrior like their father, studying statecraft to eventually inherit leadership of their lands. His arrival caught both women off guard. "I should hate you for this," he said without preamble, settling his tall frame on a wooden stool. "Your choices have destroyed years of father's careful planning. The alliance with Ragnar is shattered, and our enemies will see this as weakness." "Then why don't you hate me?" Inga asked quietly. Bjorn was silent for a long moment, his young face bearing a gravity beyond his years. "Because you chose love over duty, and part of me envies that courage. Because I've watched you fade away these past months, and I want my sister back more than I want political advantage." He reached into his tunic and withdrew a leather cord bearing a small silver raven, their family's symbol. "So others will know you remain a daughter of Magnus, whatever name you choose to bear." The gift touched Inga deeply, representing acceptance from the brother who would now bear alone the weight of their father's expectations. As Bjorn prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Write to me if you can. I want to know if the Western lands are truly as free as the stories claim, and if they are, then perhaps I will join you when I come of age." The thought of ruling through fear and force grows less appealing with each passing year. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Bjarke arrived to escort them to the harbour. He had changed from his ceremonial garments into practical travelling clothes, wool and leather, designed for long voyages. A massive pack hung from his shoulders, containing his few personal possessions and the weapons he would need in their new life. The walk through Eldthorp felt like a funeral procession. Some villagers watched from doorways and windows, with expressions ranging from sympathy to disapproval. Others deliberately turned away, unwilling to witness what they saw as shameful defection from duty and tradition. At the blacksmith's forge, Freyja's father waited with tears in his eyes and a wrapped bundle in his hands. "Tools," he explained gruffly. "A man needs good iron wherever he goes, and these were forged with love." The gift to Bjarke represented more than practical necessity. It was acceptance from a father who understood that his daughter's choices would shape her destiny. The blacksmith's blessing carried weight in their community, and his public support helped balance some of the condemnation they faced. Thorvald's ship proved to be a sturdy vessel named Sea Wolf, her hull painted in blues and greens that would blend with ocean waters. The merchant had been true to his word. Provisions were loaded, fresh water barrels secured, and maps of the western routes laid ready in his cabin. "The journey will take perhaps 3 weeks if the winds favor us," Thorvald explained as they boarded. "Olaf's settlement lies on an island with good harbors and fertile soil. They've built a proper village with houses, workshops, even a small temple to the gods." As they prepared to cast off, Inga took one last look at the shore, where her entire life had been spent. The great hall dominated the skyline, smoke rising from its hearths, where the wedding feast would have continued deep into the night. Instead, the building stood silent and disappointed, its stones bearing witness to dreams deferred and traditions shattered. Magnus appeared at the harbour's edge, just as Thorvald's men began raising the sail. Father and daughter looked at each other across the growing distance, and for a moment the anger fell away from his weathered features. He raised his hand, not in farewell, but in blessing, and Inga felt her heart crack with love and loss in equal measure. The wind caught their sail, with a sound like thunder, and the sea-wolf began her journey toward the open ocean. Behind them, the familiar shores of Norway grew smaller with each passing moment. Ahead lay unknown waters and uncertain futures, but for the first time in months, Inga felt truly free. The price of that freedom was only beginning to reveal itself. The first week at sea tested them all in ways they had not anticipated. The initial euphoria of freedom gave way to the harsh realities of life aboard a trading vessel, where space was precious and privacy non-existent. Inga discovered that her body, already changing with pregnancy, responded poorly to the constant motion of the waves. She spent long hours gripping the ship's rail, her face pale as sea foam, while her stomach rebelled against even the blandest food. Bjarke proved surprisingly gentle during these difficult moments, holding her hair back when sickness overcame her and speaking in low, soothing tones about the life they would build together. Yet she could see the worry in his pale blue eyes, the way he watched her with the protective intensity of a wolf guarding wounded prey. The practical challenges of their situation weighed heavily on his mind. "I have been thinking," he said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, "about what we will do when we reach Olaf's settlement. I am a warrior, but war is a luxury new communities can rarely afford. I must learn to be something else." Freyja looked up from the fishing line she had been mending, her clever fingers working the knots with practiced ease. Around her neck, the iron hammer pendant caught the dying light as she tilted her head thoughtfully. "My father taught me that good iron can be shaped into many forms," she said. "A sword can become a plough blade, an axe head can be reworked into a carpenter's adze. Perhaps the same is true of men." "You speak of transformation as though it were simple," Bjarke replied. "But I have known only violence for 20 years. My hands are better suited to breaking than building." "Then learn new uses for your strength," Inga suggested, though speaking still cost her effort. "Thorvald says the settlement needs people to clear forests, build houses, defend against raiders. Your warrior skills won't be useless, they'll simply serve different purposes." Thorvald himself had proven to be an invaluable source of information about their destination. During long evening conversations, he painted a picture of Olaf's settlement that was both encouraging and sobering. The community had grown from a handful of families to nearly 200 souls, including skilled craftsmen, farmers, and even a few former jarls who had grown weary of the political intrigues of the homeland. "The first years were hard," Thorvald admitted as he checked the ship's progress against his charts. "They lost a third of their people the first winter, not enough food stored, houses built too quickly without proper foundations. But those who survived learned from their mistakes. Now they have stone houses, proper granaries, and a council system where every family has a voice in major decisions." The idea of such governance fascinated Inga. In Norway, power flowed from jarls to lesser nobles to common folk in an unbroken chain of command. But Thorvald described a community where blacksmiths could speak as equals to former nobles, where decisions were made through discussion rather than decree. "How do they maintain order?" she asked. "Without clear authority, how do they prevent chaos?" "They discovered that people who choose their leaders are more likely to follow them," Thorvald explained. "And when everyone has something to lose, everyone has a reason to work toward the common good." As the second week of their journey progressed, the small group aboard the Seawolf began to function like a family. Freyja proved remarkably adept at ship life, helping the crew with their duties and learning the intricacies of navigation. Her quick mind absorbed Thorvald's lessons about reading wind patterns and star positions, skills that would prove valuable in their new home. Bjarke, meanwhile, struggled more with the enforced idleness. Accustomed to constant activity and clear objectives, he found the long days at sea frustrating. He spent hours practicing with his weapons, maintaining fighting forms that kept his body sharp but seemed increasingly irrelevant to their peaceful destination. It was during one of these practice sessions that trouble arrived. Sail on the horizon, called Gunnar, Thorvald's first mate, from his position at the crow's nest. Coming up fast from the northeast. Thorvald squinted across the water, at the distant speck that grew steadily larger. His weathered face creased with concern as he studied the approaching vessel through his bronze spyglass. "3 banks of oars," he muttered, "flying a red banner. That's no merchant vessel." The word that struck fear into every trading ship captain hung unspoken in the air raiders. In these waters, far from any protective harbour, they were vulnerable prey for those who made their living through violence and plunder. Bjarke moved to Thorvald's side, his entire demeanour shifting from frustrated idleness to predatory alertness. "How many men do they likely carry? 40, perhaps 50? My crew numbers 8, plus the 4 of us." Thorvald's voice remained steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the ship's wheel. "We cannot outrun them, and we cannot outfight them. Perhaps we can outsmart them," Freyja suggested, moving closer to the group. She had been observing the approaching ship with the same intensity she once brought to her father's forge, analyzing problems and seeking solutions. "What do raiders want most? Gold, slaves, and easy victory," Thorvald replied grimly. "Then we give them an easy victory, or at least make them think they have one." As Freyja outlined her plan, Inga felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean wind. The scheme was dangerous, requiring them to play roles that could easily result in death if discovered. Yet as she looked around at their small group, she realized they had little choice. Flight was impossible, conventional resistance suicidal. The raider ship drew closer, and they could now make out individual figures on its deck, bearded men in mail and leather, weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. At the prow stood their leader, a massive man with arms covered in tattoos and scars that spoke of countless battles. "Remember," Freyja whispered urgently as they prepared to implement their deception, "we are simple traders carrying grain and cloth to the coastal settlements. Nothing more valuable than a few silver coins for trading. Inga, you must appear to be my sister, not a jarl's daughter." "Bjarke, I know what I must do," he interrupted quietly, his hand moving to a leather pouch that hung from his belt. Inside, Inga knew, lay a collection of small iron rings, symbols of service to various lords throughout his career. One of them bore the mark of a lesser jarl from the southern provinces, a man whose death in battle 3 years earlier made verification impossible. The approaching raiders would see only what they expected to see, a merchant vessel with light escort, carrying trade goods of modest value. They could not know that among the supposed traders was a woman whose kidnapping could bring a king's ransom, or that the quiet guard possessed skills that had made him legend in warrior halls across the Northlands. As the raider ship closed to within hailing distance, Inga pressed her hand to her stomach, where their child grew. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just their own fates, but the future of the new life they carried between them. The test of their resolve had arrived far sooner than expected. The ship pulled alongside the Sea Wolf with practiced efficiency, grappling hooks biting into the wooden hull like claws. A dozen armed men leaped aboard before Thorvald could offer even token resistance, their leader following with the swagger of someone accustomed to easy victories. Captain Rolf the Red earned his name from both his flame-colored beard and the blood he had spilled across northern waters for 15 years. His eyes swept the deck with predatory calculation, cataloguing potential threats and valuable prizes. When his gaze fell on Inga and Freyja, standing together near the ship's center, his scarred lips curved into an unpleasant smile. "Well met, merchant," Rolf called to Thorvald, his voice carrying the false joviality of a cat toying with trapped mice. "Fine day for sailing, though I notice you carry passengers rather than cargo. Interesting cargo at that." Thorvald spread his hands in a gesture of resignation, playing his role perfectly. "Just simple folk seeking. Passage to the fishing settlements, Captain. Nothing here worth your time or trouble. Let me be the judge of that." Rolf stepped closer to the women, his eyes lingering on Inga's fine bone structure and the quality of her clothing, despite its deliberate simplicity. "You dress well for fishermen's wives." Freyja stepped forward, her voice carrying the rough accent of the coastal settlements. My sister married above her station, but her husband's family cast her out when she could not bear children. We seek a fresh start where her past matters less than her willingness to work. The lie came easily to her lips, supported by the props they had hastily arranged. Inga's wedding finery lay hidden beneath borrowed wool and linen, her hair braided in the simple style common to working women. Most importantly, the slight swell of her pregnancy remained concealed beneath carefully arranged clothing. Bjarke stood apart from the group, leaning against the ship's rail with the casual indifference of hired muscle. He had removed his silver arm rings and fine weapons, replacing them with plainer gear that spoke of modest means rather than noble service. One of his iron service rings, marked with the seal of a minor southern jarl, now hung visibly on a leather cord around his neck. "And you?" "Her." Hrolf's attention shifted to the giant. "What's your story, big man?" "Erik Ironson," Bjarke replied, using the false name they had agreed upon. "Guard service for Jarl Olmund of Stavanger until he fell at the Battle of Hafrsfjord. These women hired me to see them safely to their destination." Hrolf nodded slowly, recognizing the ring's authenticity even if he could not verify its current relevance. "Olmund the Stout. I knew him by reputation, good warrior, poor politician. His death was no surprise." The casual dismissal of his supposed former lord's fate seemed to satisfy Hrolf's suspicions. A landless warrior seeking employment was common enough, and Bjarke's obvious competence made him a believable protector for traveling women. "What cargo do you carry?" One of Hrolf's men called from the hold where they had been searching for valuables. "Grain, salted fish, wool cloth," Thorvald replied. "Trade goods for the northern settlements. Profit comes from volume, not individual value." This, too, was partially true. Thorvald had stocked his ship with legitimate trade goods to support their cover story. Hidden beneath the grain sacks and cloth bundles lay their real treasures, Magnus's silver, jewelry, and the tools that would help them establish new lives. But a casual search would reveal only what they expected to find. Hrolf studied them all for a long moment, his experienced eyes probing for deception. Inga felt her heart hammering against her ribs, certain that her noble bearing would betray them. Yet the raider captain seemed to see only what they presented, ordinary people on ordinary business. "Search the ship thoroughly," he commanded. His men, "Take anything of value, but leave the cargo. We're not merchants ourselves." As the raiders began their systematic looting, taking what small treasures the crew possessed, Freyja caught Inga's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the ship's stern. There, partially concealed by coils of rope, lay the leather satchel containing a precious cargo, ancient runestones carved by her grandfather, a master craftsman whose work was renowned throughout Norway. The stones were not just valuable artifacts, but represented their connection to heritage and tradition. More practically, they could be traded in their new home for tools, livestock, or materials needed to build their future. Losing them would be a blow to both their resources and their spirits. Moving with careful nonchalance, Inga drifted toward the stern, while the raiders focused their attention on the ship's cabin and storage areas. The satchel lay within reach, but retrieving it without notice would require perfect timing. That opportunity came when one of the younger raiders stumbled while climbing from the hold, spilling a bag of the crew's personal coins across the deck. In the confusion, as men scrambled to collect the scattered silver, Inga slipped the precious satchel beneath her cloak and moved away from the area. The search continued for another hour, during which Hrolf questioned each passenger about their destinations and purposes. His interrogation revealed nothing suspicious. Thorvald's story held under scrutiny, Freyja's invented background proved convincing, and Bjarke's taciturn responses matched perfectly with their expectations of a displaced warrior. When the raiders finally prepared to depart, Hrolf paused to address Bjarke directly. "If you tire of nursemaiding refugees, Erik Ironson, There's always a place aboard my ship for a man with your skills. The pay is good, and the work has its own rewards. I'll keep that in mind, Bjarke replied neutrally, though I've sworn to see these women safely to their destination. Honor among thieves, Rolf laughed. I respect that. Perhaps our paths will cross again under different circumstances. As the raiders departed with their modest haul, the crew of the Seawolf began assessing the damage. They had lost personal possessions, some silver and a few barrels of ale, but the ship remained intact and their most important secrets undiscovered. Most critically, their passengers' true identities remained hidden. Well done, all of you, Thorvald said quietly once the raider ship had disappeared beyond the horizon. That could have ended very differently. Inga sank onto a coil of rope, her legs suddenly weak with delayed reaction. The strain of maintaining their deception while pregnant and terrified had taken its toll. Bjarke moved to her side immediately, his strong hands steadying her as the magnitude of their narrow escape became clear. The stones? Freyja asked anxiously. Safe, Inga confirmed, revealing the hidden satchel. Though I thought my heart might stop when Rolf looked directly at me. He saw only what we wanted him to see, Freyja observed with satisfaction. Sometimes the best disguise is simply being unremarkable. As the Seawolf resumed its journey westward, the small group reflected on their first real test as fugitives from their old lives. They had proven they could work together under pressure, think quickly in crisis, and protect what mattered most. Yet the encounter had also revealed how precarious their situation remained. One wrong word, one suspicious detail, could have destroyed everything they were trying to build. The western settlement still lay weeks away, and the ocean held many more dangers than a single band of raiders. 3 days after their encounter with the raiders, Thorvald's expression grew troubled as he studied the horizon through his bronze spyglass. The weather had been fair, the winds favorable, yet something in the merchant's demeanor suggested problems ahead. He kept checking his charts and instruments, muttering calculations under his breath. What troubles you? Bjarke asked, noting the captain's increased vigilance. We should have sighted the outer islands by now, Thorvald replied, lowering his spyglass with a frown. According to my calculations, we're in the right position, but the landmarks don't match what I remember from previous voyages. Freyja joined them at the ship's bow, her sharp eyes scanning the empty ocean. Could we have been blown off course during the storm 2 nights ago? Possible, but my instruments suggest otherwise. The stars confirm our position, yet Thorvald trailed off, his weathered face creased with concern. As if summoned by their conversation, a shout from the crow's nest interrupted their discussion. Land ahead, rocky coastline, looks like islands. Relief flooded through Inga as she joined the others at the rail. After weeks at sea, the sight of solid ground felt like a benediction from the gods themselves. Yet, as they drew closer to the cluster of islands emerging from the morning mist, something felt wrong. The harbours were empty where Thorvald had expected to see fishing boats and trading vessels. No smoke rose from settlements that should have been bustling with activity. Most disturbing of all, several of the wooden structures visible from the water bore the blackened scars of recent fire. This isn't right, Thorvald murmured, his voice tight with apprehension. Olaf's settlement should be thriving. Where are the people? As the Seawolf approached the main harbour, the extent of the devastation became clear. What had once been a prosperous village now lay in ruins. Houses stood roofless and empty, their timbers scattered or reduced to charcoal. The pier extended into water, littered with the broken remains of fishing boats and trading vessels. Raiders, Bjarke said grimly, recognizing the signs of systematic destruction. This wasn't random violence. Someone wanted to ensure this place could never recover. They anchored in the harbour's deepest section, away from the debris that choked the shallower waters. Thorvald's crew prepared a small boat, while the passengers wrestled with the implications of what they were seeing. Their destination, their hope for a new life, lay in ruins before them. We need to search for survivors, Inga said, though her heart sank at the prospect. Perhaps some escaped to the inner islands or found shelter in the hills. The landing party consisted of Thorvald, Bjarke, Freyja, and two of the more experienced crew members. Inga remained aboard the ship. Despite her protests, her pregnancy made the potentially dangerous exploration inadvisable, and they could not risk losing her if survivors proved hostile. The settlement's main street told a story of sudden violence and overwhelming force. Doors hung splintered from their hinges, windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and personal possessions lay scattered in the mud where they had been dropped by fleeing owners. Yet something about the destruction pattern seemed strange to Bjarke's experienced eye. "Look at the burn marks," he called to the others, kneeling beside the remains of what had been the community's meeting hall. These fires were set deliberately, but not by raiders seeking quick plunder. This was methodical, designed to destroy completely. Freyja found the first bodies near the blacksmith's forge, and her sharp intake of breath drew the others quickly to her side. 3 men lay sprawled in the workshop, but their wounds told an unexpected story. These were not the random cuts and thrusts of battle, but precise strikes that spoke of execution rather than combat. They were killed after the fighting ended. Thorvald observed, his merchant's experience with violence serving him well. Someone wanted to ensure no witnesses remained. As they explored further into the settlement, more disturbing evidence emerged. The community's grain stores had been systematically destroyed rather than looted, a senseless act for raiders who could have used the supplies. The temple to Thor had been desecrated with symbols none of them recognized, strange markings that seemed almost ritualistic in nature. It was in the ruins of what had been Olaf's own house that they found the most shocking discovery. Hidden beneath collapsed timber and debris lay a wooden chest, its iron lock broken, but its contents surprisingly intact. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were documents that revealed the truth behind the settlement's destruction. Thorvald's hands shook as he read the carefully preserved letters. "These are correspondence between Olaf and King Harald," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. The settlement wasn't just a refuge for displaced families. It was the center of a planned rebellion against Norwegian rule. The documents painted a picture far different from the simple, farming community they had expected to find. Olaf had been gathering disaffected nobles, displaced jarls, and ambitious warriors who opposed King Harald's consolidation of power. The western settlement was intended to serve as a base for eventual return and conquest of their homeland. "Look at this," Freyja said, pointing to a particular letter bearing King Harald's personal seal. "It's dated only 2 months ago. He discovered the plot and sent his own ships to eliminate the threat." Bjarke studied the royal correspondence with growing comprehension. "This explains the systematic destruction, the executions. Harald couldn't afford to let word spread that organized resistance existed. Better to make it appear the settlement simply failed. The implications struck them all like physical blows. They had fled to what they believed was a peaceful refuge, only to discover it had been a center of political rebellion. Worse still, anyone who arrived seeking to join the community would be viewed as potential rebels themselves. "We cannot stay here," Thorvald said flatly. "If Harald's ships return and find us, they'll assume we were part of the conspiracy. Our presence here makes us enemies of the crown." As they prepared to return to the ship with their devastating news, Freyja made one final discovery that changed everything. In the ashes of the temple, she found a carved stone tablet bearing runic inscriptions that made her blood run cold. "This isn't just about rebellion," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to this inscription. By order of King Harald, let it be known that Magnus Eriksson of Eldthorp stands accused of treason through correspondence with the rebel Olaf. The jarl's lands are forfeit, his family declared outlaws." The words hit Inga like a physical blow when they returned to the ship with their findings. Her father, stripped of his titles and lands for an association she had unknowingly created by choosing this destination. The marriage alliance with Ragnar, designed to strengthen his position, had been destroyed by her defiance. Now even his loyalty to the crown was questioned because of their flight. "It gets worse," Thorvald continued reluctantly. "According to other documents we found, Harold has placed a substantial bounty on our capture, specifically yours, Inga, and Bjarke's. Dead or alive, with particular emphasis on questioning you about your father's alleged connections to the rebellion." Bjarke's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "They think Magnus was funding Olaf's conspiracy through our escape. Our flight wasn't seen as a personal matter, it was interpreted as political defection." The twisted logic was clear now. A jarl's daughter and his most trusted warrior fleeing immediately after contact with a known rebel settlement could only mean one thing in King Harold's suspicious mind. The timing of their departure, combined with Thorvald's known trading relationship with Olaf, had created a web of circumstantial evidence that condemned them all. "So what now?" Inga asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We cannot return home. I am disowned and Bjarke is oath-broken. We cannot stay here. This place is a graveyard. And we cannot simply disappear. Harold's reach extends throughout the known world." Thorvald was quiet for a long moment, studying his charts with the intensity of a man calculating impossible odds. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of desperate hope. "There is another option," he said slowly. "The Irish monks speak of lands beyond the sunset, across the Western Ocean, places where Harold's authority means nothing because Harold has never heard of them. It would be a journey into the unknown, with no certainty of success or even survival." Freyja fingered the runestones in her pouch, the carved symbols representing everything they had lost and everything they might yet find. "Unknown lands for unknown people," she mused. "Perhaps that's what we've become." The plot twist had revealed that their escape was not the end of their troubles, but the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous. They were no longer refugees seeking a new life. They were fugitives from a king who saw conspiracy in their very existence. As the sea-wolf prepared to sail from the ruins of their shattered dreams, each of them understood that their next decision would determine not just their own fates, but potentially the lives of everyone they had left behind in Norway. The Western Ocean beckoned, vast and empty, and promising nothing but the chance to disappear into legend. The decision to sail into the unknown Western Ocean was not made lightly. For 3 days they anchored in the ruins of Olaf's settlement, while Thorvald consulted every chart, manuscript, and piece of sailor's lore he possessed. The prospect of venturing beyond the edge of the known world terrified even experienced seafarers, yet the alternative, certain death at Harold's hands, made the choice inevitable. "The Irish monks who visit our trading posts speak of green islands beyond the sunset," Thorvald explained as they huddled around charts in his cabin. "They call it Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth. Brother Brendan claims to have sailed there twice, though many question his tales." Bjarke studied the rough sketches that marked the supposed routes to these mythical lands. "How far beyond the known seas?" "Perhaps a month, if the winds favor us and the weather holds. But we would be sailing on faith rather than knowledge. No landmarks, no established routes, no certainty that land exists where the monks claim to have found it." Inga felt the child stir within her womb as she contemplated the magnitude of their gamble. By the time they reached these legendary shores, if they existed at all, she would be well into her pregnancy. The thought of giving birth in an unknown wilderness, far from any midwife or healer, filled her with terror. Yet what choice remained? "There's something else we must consider," Freyja said quietly, her fingers working nervously at the iron hammer pendant around her neck. "If we disappear into legend, we can never return, never know what becomes of our families, never send word that we survived. We become dead to everyone we've ever known." The weight of that truth settled over them like a burial shroud. Inga thought of her brother Bjorn, who would inherit the burden of rebuilding their family's shattered reputation, of her father Magnus facing charges of treason because of choices he had never made, of the servants and retainers whose lives would be disrupted by the political earthquake their flight had triggered. "Perhaps that is the price of freedom," Bjarke said finally, though his voice carried little conviction. "To be truly free, we must abandon everything that once defined us." As they prepared for the journey into uncertainty, each member of their small band wrestled with private doubts and fears. Thorvald's crew, when informed of their captain's intention, reacted with a mixture of terror and excitement. 3 of his 8 sailors chose to remain behind, preferring to take their chances as refugees in known lands rather than venture into the void. The remaining 5, all young men with little to lose and much to gain from a successful discovery, committed themselves to the voyage with the fatalistic courage of those who had already lost everything. The preparations themselves became a form of meditation, each task performed with the gravity of last rites. They redistributed supplies to account for their reduced crew, packed precious fresh water into every available container, and studied the movements of seabirds that might guide them toward distant shores. Inga carefully wrapped her mother's silver brooch in silk and leather, protecting it for a future she could barely imagine. It was during these final preparations that they received their last terrible surprise. Gunnar, keeping watch from the crow's nest, called down with urgency that froze their blood. Ships approaching from the east, 3 vessels, flying royal banners. Through Thorvald's spyglass, they could see the approaching fleet, clearly sleek warships designed for speed and combat, their dragon-proud hulls cutting through the water with predatory grace. At the center flew the raven banner of King Harald himself, marking this as no casual patrol, but a deliberate hunting expedition. "They've found us," Thorvald said grimly. "Someone must have reported our arrival here, or they've been tracking our route since we left Norway." Bjarke calculated the distances with a warrior's eye for tactical situations. How long until they reach the harbor? Perhaps 2 hours, if the wind holds steady. Less, if it increases. The timing could not have been worse. The Sea-Wolf lay anchored in the harbor's deepest section, her holds only partially reorganized for the extended ocean voyage. To flee now would mean leaving behind critical supplies and sailing into the unknown with dangerously inadequate provisions. Yet to remain meant certain capture and the brutal interrogation that would follow. "There's another option," Inga said suddenly, her mind racing as she studied the harbor's layout. "The ruins provide cover, and they'll expect us to flee rather than fight. What if we don't give them what they expect?" Her proposal was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to outrun ships specifically designed for pursuit, they would hide in plain sight among the settlement's debris. The harbor contained the broken hulls of dozens of vessels, fishing boats, trading ships, even a few warships that had been scuttled during the community's destruction. With careful positioning and some creative camouflage, the Sea-Wolf might be mistaken for another piece of wreckage. "It's madness," Thorvald protested. "If they search systematically, they won't," Bjarke interrupted, his strategic mind already working through the possibilities. "A royal expedition doesn't waste time examining every piece of debris. They'll look for obvious signs of our presence, smoke, movement, intact vessels. If we can convince them the settlement is truly abandoned, they may not linger long enough for a thorough search." The plan required perfect execution and considerable luck, but it offered their only realistic chance of survival. Working with desperate efficiency, they moved the Sea-Wolf into position among the skeletal remains of other ships. Thorvald's crew draped her masts with torn sailcloth and debris, making her appear damaged beyond use. They scattered personal belongings on the nearby shore as if abandoned by fleeing refugees, then concealed themselves in the ruins of the settlement's largest building. As the royal ships entered the harbor, Inga pressed herself against the cold stone wall and tried to quiet her hammering heart. Through gaps in the ruined masonry, she could see the lead vessel clearly, a magnificent warship that spoke of royal power and unlimited resources. At its prow stood a figure in rich furs and gold ornaments, his bearing unmistakably that of high nobility. "Earl Sigurd," Bjarke whispered, recognizing the king's chief enforcer. "Harald's own nephew. He wouldn't come personally unless the stakes were enormous." The royal expedition conducted exactly the type of cursory search they had hoped for. Sigurd's men examined the most obvious hiding places, intact buildings, caves along the shoreline, the larger ship hulks, but showed little interest in the systematic investigation that would have revealed their presence. After 2 hours of increasingly frustrated searching, the Earl called his captains together for what appeared to be a heated discussion. From their hiding place, they could not hear the words being spoken, but the gestures and expressions suggested disagreement about their next course of action. One captain pointed westward, toward the open ocean, while another indicated the northern islands. Sigurd himself seemed torn between competing theories about their quarry's whereabouts. The debate continued for nearly an hour before reaching resolution. The royal ships began to withdraw from the harbour, but instead of departing entirely, they took up positions at strategic points around the island group. Clearly, Sigurd intended to establish a blockade that would prevent any vessel from leaving undetected. "They're not giving up," Freyja observed quietly. "They mean to starve us out or wait for us to make a mistake." The siege mentality that settled over their small group carried echoes of their homeland's warrior culture. Like their ancestors facing overwhelming odds, they found strength in acceptance of their situation and determination to make their enemies pay dearly for victory. Yet this was not a battle that could be won through conventional means. Their only weapons were cunning, patience, and the slim hope that opportunity would eventually present itself. As night fell over the ruined settlement, they maintained careful watch while planning their next move. The royal ships showed no sign of departing, their anchor lights forming a constellation of menace around their hiding place. Escape seemed impossible, yet the alternative, surrender and certain death, was unacceptable. It was during the darkest hour before dawn that salvation arrived from an unexpected source. A thick fog began rolling in from the western ocean, the kind of dense mist that could reduce visibility to mere yards and transform familiar waters into a maze of confusion. Mariners called such weather the grey blindness, dangerous to navigation but potentially invaluable to those seeking concealment. "This is our chance," Thorvald whispered urgently. "If we can reach open water before the fog lifts, we might escape their net entirely." The decision had to be made quickly. Within hours, the sun would burn away their misty cover, leaving them exposed once again. They had perhaps 4 hours of concealment, enough time to clear the harbour and gain distance toward the Western Ocean, but only if they moved immediately. As they prepared to risk everything on this final gamble, Inga felt the child move within her again, as if responding to her elevated heartbeat. She placed her hand protectively over the small life they carried between them and whispered a silent prayer to whatever gods might listen. Their journey into legend was about to begin, assuming they survived the next few hours. The fog thickened around them like a divine blessing, and the sea-wolf began to move like a ghost ship through waters that might lead to salvation or doom. Behind them lay everything they had ever known. Ahead lay only hope and the vast uncertainty of the Western Sea. The fog embraced the sea-wolf like the breath of sleeping gods, transforming the familiar harbour into an alien landscape of shadows and whispers. Thorvald's crew worked in absolute silence, their movements guided by years of experience and the desperate precision of men who knew that one misplaced sound could mean death for them all. Bjarke stood at the ship's bow, his enhanced senses straining through the grey blindness for any sign of the royal vessels. The blockade ships had taken positions based on clear weather assumptions, spaced to maintain visual contact and prevent any vessel from slipping past undetected. But fog changed everything, reducing their advantage to mere chance and making their careful positioning a liability. How close? Thorvald whispered from his position at the steering oar, trusting Bjarke's warrior instincts to guide them through the maze of hidden enemies. Portside, perhaps 50 yards, Bjarke replied in barely audible tones. I can hear their anchor chain creaking. The sound carried across the Dines, water like a ghost's warning, metal grinding against metal as the royal ship rode the gentle swells. They were so close that voices from the enemy deck drifted through the mist, guards complaining about the weather and speculating about their quarry's whereabouts. Inga pressed herself against the ship's rail, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might betray them. The child within her seemed to sense her terror, stirring restlessly as if sharing her anxiety about the dangers surrounding them. She clutched Freyja's hand for comfort, drawing strength from her friend's unwavering courage. The sea wolf moved through the water with supernatural quietness, her crew having muffled the oars with strips of cloth and secured every loose rope or piece of equipment that might create unwanted noise. They glided like a phantom ship through the grey void, following Thorvald's instinctive navigation toward what he prayed was open ocean. A new sound emerged from the fog ahead, the splash of oars and low voices speaking in urgent tones. One of the royal ships was moving, perhaps searching for the very escape route they were attempting to use. The voices grew louder, and Bjarke could make out individual words carried on the still air. Saw movement near the harbour mouth, just debris shifting with the tide. Captain wants us to investigate. The sea wolf froze in the water as Thorvald raised his hand for absolute stillness. They could hear the approaching vessel clearly now, its crew rowing in the methodical rhythm of a search pattern. The distance was closing rapidly, perhaps 30 yards, maybe less. Freyja's fingers found the iron hammer pendant at her throat, and she offered a silent prayer to Thor for protection. Beside her, Inga felt the terrible helplessness of absolute vulnerability. They could not fight, could not run, could only hope that the gods who had brought them this far would not abandon them now. There, a voice called through. The fog, startlingly close, something large in the water. Bring us alongside. The royal ship's outline began to materialize through the mist like a nightmare taking shape. They could see the silhouettes of armed men at the rail, searching for whatever had caught their attention. In moments, discovery would be inevitable. It was then that Bjarke made a decision that would save them all or doom them spectacularly. Moving with the fluid grace of a predator, he slipped over the side of the sea wolf into the frigid water, disappearing beneath the surface without so much as a splash. The royal ship continued its approach, now close enough that individual faces became visible through the fog. Earl Sigurd's men were professional soldiers, alert and dangerous, their weapons ready for immediate use. They had spotted something, perhaps the sea wolf's mast, rising above the natural waterline, or the unnatural straightness of her hull among the harbour debris. "Bring torches," commanded a voice with the authority of rank. "I want to see what we're dealing with." The flames would penetrate the fog's concealment, revealing their presence beyond any possibility of denial. Inga closed her eyes and prepared for the violence that would surely follow the clash of weapons, the cries of wounded men, the end of all their hopes and dreams. Instead, chaos erupted from beneath the water. Bjarke surfaced beside the royal vessel like some creature from the depths, his massive hands grasping the ship's steering oar with irresistible force. Before the crew could react, he had wrenched the oar from its housing and sent their vessel spinning helplessly in the current. Shouts of alarm pierced the fog as the royal ship lost all control, its crew struggling to understand what had happened. In the confusion, several men fell overboard, their armor dragging them beneath the surface. Others rushed to help their drowning comrades, abandoning their search in favor of immediate survival. The sea wolf took advantage of the chaos to slip past the crippled vessel, her crew pulling strongly for the open ocean. Behind them, angry voices demanded answers, while torches flickered uselessly in the impenetrable mist. By the time order was restored aboard the royal ship, their quarry had vanished into the grey wilderness of fog and ocean. Bjarke hauled himself back aboard, water streaming from his clothes and beard. His pale blue eyes held the satisfaction of a warrior who had turned disaster into victory through courage and quick thinking. "The mouth of the harbour lies ahead," Thorvald announced quietly. "Beyond that open ocean and whatever fate awaits us." As they cleared the last headland and felt the ocean swells beneath their keel, each member of their small band understood that they had crossed an invisible line. Behind them lay the known world, with all its certainties and constraints. Ahead stretched the endless western sea, promising either death or transformation. The Western Ocean received them with deceptive calm, its vast expanse stretching beyond every horizon like the edge of creation itself. As the fog began to thin with the rising sun, revealing the magnitude of the void they had entered, even the most optimistic among them felt the weight of their audacious gamble. 3 weeks they sailed into emptiness, guided only by Thorvald's interpretation of ancient Irish texts and the uncertain testimony of monks who claimed divine guidance for their voyages. Each day brought new challenges, storms that tested their ship's endurance, supplies that dwindled faster than anticipated, and the constant psychological pressure of sailing beyond all known landmarks. Inga's pregnancy advanced noticeably during those weeks at sea, her condition becoming impossible to conceal despite the loose clothing she wore. The child seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as if drawing life from the adventure that surrounded its development. Yet the approaching birth filled everyone aboard with anxiety. They possessed no experience with childbirth, no midwife's knowledge, no proper supplies for such a momentous event. It was during the 4th week, when their water supplies had dropped to dangerously low levels and several crew members spoke quietly of turning back, that Freyja made the discovery that changed everything. She had been studying her grandfather's runestones by candlelight, seeking guidance or comfort in their ancient symbols, when she noticed something that had escaped previous examination. "Look at this carving," she called to the others, her voice tight with excitement. "I always thought this symbol represented a tree, but see how the branches curve. And these marks at the base, they're not roots." Thorvald studied the stone with growing amazement. "Those aren't branches. They're the outline of islands. And these marks show harbours, fresh water sources, even settlements. The runestone was not merely decorative or religious. It was a map." Freyja's grandfather, a master craftsman who had travelled widely in his youth, had encoded directions to distant lands in the very stones they carried as keepsakes. The realization that they possessed actual navigation information rather than sailing on pure hope transformed their desperate flight into a calculated journey. According to these markings, Thorvald calculated, tracing the carved symbols with his weathered finger. "We should sight land within 2 days if we adjust our course slightly northwest." The adjustment proved prophetic. On the morning of their 28th day at sea, as supplies reached their absolute limit and several crew members showed signs of scurvy, the cry they had prayed to hear finally echoed from the crow's nest. Land, green shores ahead. The coastline that emerged from the morning mist exceeded their wildest hopes. Unlike the harsh fjords of Norway, these shores showed gentle beaches backed by forests that seemed to glow with impossible verdance. Rivers carried fresh water to the sea, their mouths marked by the kind of rich soil that promised abundant harvests. Most encouraging of all, smoke rose from several points along the coast, evidence of human habitation. As they approached the largest bay, they encountered the most remarkable sight of their entire journey. A fleet of boats came out to greet them, not warships or raiding vessels, but fishing boats and small craft filled with people whose faces showed curiosity rather than hostility. The inhabitants of this new land proved to be a mixture of Irish monks, Norse settlers who had arrived years earlier, and indigenous people who had welcomed the newcomers peacefully. They had created a unique community that blended traditions and knowledge from multiple cultures, exactly the kind of society that Inga and her companions had dreamed might be possible. "Welcome," called their leader, a grizzled Norseman named Einar, who served as elected chief of the settlement. "We've been expecting ships from the east, though we feared none would come after word reached us of King Harald's purges." The community that welcomed them had grown from 20 souls to nearly 300 in the space of 5 years. They had established successful farms, workshops, and even a small monastery where Irish scholars preserved knowledge from both Christian and Norse traditions. Most importantly, they had developed a system of governance based on consensus rather than royal decree, exactly the kind of society that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility. As the Sea-Wolf entered the harbor, Inga felt the child move within her with unusual vigor, as if responding to the promise of solid ground and permanent shelter. The timing seemed almost miraculous. Her body was preparing for birth just as they reached the sanctuary that would allow their child to enter the world safely. "The runestone saved us," Freyja marveled, fingering the carved symbols that had guided them across the unknown ocean. "My grandfather's wisdom reached across time to bring us home." Bjarke stood beside Inga at the ship's rail, his massive arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they watched their new home grow larger with each passing moment. "We are no longer fugitives," he said quietly. "We are pioneers." The transformation from hunted refugees to founding members of a new society felt like divine intervention. They had risked everything on an impossible journey and discovered not just survival, but the chance to build the kind of life they had never dared imagine possible. As their feet touched solid ground for the first time in a month, each of them understood that they had not merely escaped their old world, they had found their true home. 5 years had passed since the Sea-Wolf first entered the harbor of what the settlers called Fridland, the place of peace. The morning sun cast long shadows across fertile fields where barley and wheat grew tall, tended by hands that had once known only the harsh soil of Norwegian fjords. From her position on the hill overlooking the settlement, Inga could see the transformation that love and determination had wrought. The child she had carried across unknown seas now ran through those fields with the boundless energy of youth. Magnus, named for his grandfather, despite the pain that name carried, possessed his father's pale blue eyes and his mother's quick intelligence. At 4 years old, he spoke the mixed tongue common to their community, where Norse words blended naturally with Irish phrases, and the occasional term borrowed from the indigenous people who had shared their knowledge so generously. Bjarke emerged from their house, carrying the tools of his new trade, not weapons of war, but implements of construction and cultivation. The hands that had once dealt death now built homes, carved furniture, and taught young men the skills needed to create rather than destroy. The transformation had not been easy for a man whose identity had been forged in battle, but love had proven stronger than old habits. "The council meeting begins soon," he reminded Inga gently, settling beside her on the wooden bench he had crafted from local timber. "Thorvald brings news from his latest trading voyage." The community's governing council had evolved into something unique, a blend of Norse things and Irish monasteries, where decisions were made through careful discussion rather than royal decree. Men and women participated equally, their voices carrying weight based on wisdom and experience rather than birthright or wealth. Freyja appeared at their gate, her own life having taken surprising turns in the 5 years since their arrival. She had married Einar's son, a quiet scholar who appreciated her sharp mind and gentle heart. More remarkably, she had established herself as the settlement's primary healer, combining knowledge learned from her grandmother with techniques shared by Irish monks and indigenous medicine workers. "Any word from the homeland?" Inga asked, as her friend approached, though she dreaded the answer as much as she longed for it. "Thorvald spoke privately with some of us yesterday," Freyja replied carefully. "The news is mixed, some good, some troubling." They walked together toward the community hall, a large building constructed in the Irish style, with stone foundations and a thatched roof that could accommodate the entire settlement when necessary. Inside, familiar faces gathered around the central fire: Norse farmers, Irish monks, indigenous elders, and the children who represented their shared future. Thorvald stood to address the assembly, his weathered face bearing the gravity of a man who carried news across dangerous waters. In his hands, he held several pieces of correspondence that had taken months to reach them through a network of trusted traders and sympathetic monasteries. "Magnus Eriksson has been cleared of all charges of treason," he announced, his words carrying clearly through the hall. King Harald's own investigation revealed that the accusations were based on false evidence, planted by enemies seeking to destroy his reputation. Relief flooded through Inga like warm honey, followed immediately by a sharp pang of loss. Her father had survived the political storm their departure had created, but at what cost? How many years had he spent defending his honor against charges that should never have been brought? "There is more," Thorvald continued. "Your brother Bjorn has distinguished himself in the king's service and been granted lands of his own. He sends his love and hopes that someday you might find a way to communicate safely." The personal news warmed Inga's heart, but Thorvald's expression suggested that not everything he carried was so encouraging. "Earl Sigurd continues to search for evidence of your survival. He has convinced King Harald that living fugitives represent a threat to royal authority that cannot be tolerated. Ships still patrol the northern routes, questioning travelers and investigating any reports of Norse settlements beyond the known lands. The sobering reminder that their past still reached across the ocean tempered their joy at the good news. They remained exiles, unable to return home or communicate openly with the families they had left behind. Yet as Inga looked around the hall at the community they had helped build, she realized that the loss had been transformed into something precious. After the council meeting, the small group of original refugees gathered privately to reflect on their journey and its meaning. The house they shared had become a symbol of the new society they were creating. Norse architectural traditions adapted to local materials and climate, decorated with carved symbols that honored both their heritage and their new beginning. Young Magnus played at their feet with toys carved by his father's gentle hands, horses and ships and warriors engaged in adventures rather than battles. The child spoke casually of his plans to explore the forests and rivers that surrounded their settlement, his worldview shaped by abundance rather than scarcity, possibility rather than limitation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices?" Inga asked, as the evening fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. "If I had married Ragnar, if we had never left Norway?" Bjarke considered the question seriously, his pale blue eyes reflecting the flames. "I think we would have lived smaller lives," he said finally. "Safe, perhaps, but incomplete. Here, we have discovered who we truly are beneath the roles others assigned us." Freyja nodded thoughtfully. "I think about the children who will grow up here, your Magnus, my future sons and daughters, all the little ones born into this community. They will never know the weight of unchangeable tradition, never accept that their worth is determined by their birth." As the fire burned lower, they shared stories of the day's small victories and gentle challenges. The letter-writing lessons Inga taught to settlement children, the furniture workshop where Bjarke trained young craftsmen, the healing garden where Freyja cultivated medicinal herbs in soil far richer than anything they had known in Norway. When young Magnus finally fell asleep in his father's arms, Bjarke carried him to the small room they had prepared with such hope years earlier. The wooden horse from Inga's childhood sat on a shelf beside new toys and the rune stones that had guided their impossible journey. He will never understand what we sacrificed to give him this life, Inga whispered as they watched their son sleep peacefully. Perhaps that is the greatest gift we can offer, Bjarke replied quietly. The freedom to take peace for granted. Outside their window, the lights of Fridland twinkled like earth-bound stars, each one representing a family that had chosen hope over certainty, love over duty, and the courage to build something new rather than inherit something old. Their story had become legend, but they had gained something far more valuable, the chance to live as they chose.